Shalom, everyone. It's time for ancient Jewish wisdom for a modern world that will change your thinking and change your life. Welcome to the Dust of the Rabbi podcast with Rabbi Brian Bileci.
Welcome to episode 4, The Parables of Jesus. I'm Brian Garza. This is Rabbi Brian Bileci.
Shalom, my friend.
Shalom.
Here we are again.
I know, here we are again. We're going to get into some parables today, or one. What parable did you want to get into today?
Well, you know, it's so funny. We left off last time talking about Matthew chapter 13, and we talked about, Jesus always taught in parables, that the crowds followed him, and we said something very specific, that followers are not always learners. And I think it'd be really good to talk about today how to be a disciple of Jesus, you have to be a learner. Yeah. And there's a great parable for that found in Matthew chapter 13. You probably know it. It's called the Sower and the Seed. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a good one to talk about, because if you think about Sunday school, did you ever learn that in Sunday school?
I did. A lot of us did.
Yeah, but no one ever explained to you the meaning of it.
No, it was something about rocks and something about throwing seed.
And dirt and all that kind
That's
of stuff.
All I thought as a kid.
So what's funny about the parables of Jesus, we said they talked about very natural things, very everyday life situations. Like people were either farmers or they were masons or carpenters. Yeah. And not too many people were rabbis. So rabbis would take these stories, not about other rabbis, but about everyday occupations and everyday situations.
Wow.
So we want to kind of dive into this one because I think it really relates to where people are at. And we said last week, as we've been talking about each lesson about how Jesus is a rabbi, we realized that was the first century way to teach a crowd of people, because in a crowd of people, you don't know who you're dealing with.
Right.
And there's something unique about the number 4 when it comes to Jews and how they break down interpretations. And instead of it being dualistic, it's like either a bad student or a good student, there's kind of like grades in between. So when you think about 4, at Passover, there are 4 different kinds of kids that we actually think of talking to at Passover. They're going to ask the question, why are we keeping this? What's all the laws concerning it? Some kids don't even know how to ask the question, so they say nothing. And you just think about your own kids, whether they're in class or they're in Sunday school or if they're at the synagogue. They don't always know what to ask. Mm-hmm. And some kids ask a lot of questions.
My son does.
Yeah.
A lot of questions.
And asking questions, we found out, was essential to learning. Mm-hmm. It's not just for Bible college students. It's for every age and stage of life. You have to ask questions to the right person at the right time to get the right answer.
Right, to find the truth.
Yeah, so here's a question we left off with last week. Matthew 13:10, right here out of the Tree of Life version. It says, then the disciples came to Yeshua, and they said, why do you speak to them in parables? They asked him this question, and he replied to them, and he says, to you it's been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. Now, if you just think about that for a minute, the you and the them, how do we break down the you and the them?
Yeah, you said last time that they were the followers,
Mm-hmm.
and then there were the disciples.
Yeah. So the followers are the masses of people that he fed, like 5,000 men at one time, not including their wives and children. Mm-hmm. Another 4,000 at another event in Jesus' life. He does this miracle, especially one with 5,000, 2 fish and 5 loaves. There's a lot of people following Jesus, but not everybody's listening with ears that can hear and are watching and looking with eyes that can see. Mm. They tend to be kind of like just the onlookers, but they're not really looking intently and intentionally. A disciple is different from a follower, because a follower follows because you're feeding them. Maybe a follower follows because they know you're famous. Think about Twitter. How many followers, do we try to gain on social media, right? And then we all go for the likes, right? And it's not the same with a rabbi. A rabbi is looking for a few good students that will follow him, but will progress to being a learner or a disciple who's disciplined.
Right. You could break down the follower. It's almost like they're there for the feeling almost.
Or the excitement of it all.
It's the excitement of it all.
The newness, right?
Right. And the only people that really stay are the disciples, because they really want to know, what are you really trying to say? Because they're starting to get the truth.
Yeah. It's kind of like your Instagram followers. Instagrammers are not really looking to read anything or learn anything. No. They're looking for pictures, things that look good, the reels, yeah. And while that's needed in a world where everything's moving so quick and so fast, This is not happening in the days of Jesus. There is no Uber drivers. There's no getting you here and there with fast transportation.
Yeah.
You've got to walk there. You've got to take a camel. You've got to, travel in a distance to get from Galilee to Jerusalem.
Right.
It's a long road. So to follow a rabbi on a dusty road from Galilee to Jerusalem was a huge thing. And there was at least 3 times a year that Jesus would have these disciples following him. So out of all the masses, only 12 was he committed to. Just think about that. What if you, Brian Garza, was one of the 12 that Jesus hand-selected? How special would you feel?
I mean, yeah, I would feel somewhat of a burden almost.
Wait a minute. I think we have a rabbi-disciple relationship too.
True. Well, no, I guess it's no different because
it is no different.
It is no
That's what I'm
different.
trying to get you to see.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
It's like the parable is meant to change our mentality. It's trying to take something we're very familiar with,
Yeah.
and it's trying to cause us to think beyond the familiar and go deeper in our faith and look for the spiritual essence of it. Because we said Hebrew works differently when it comes to the language of the rabbis,
Right.
the language of the Jewish people. Hebrew is function over form. And we said that if we can actually understand the function within the story and within the parable, we will be able to learn how to function in a kingdom reality, even when the rabbi is not present. And I think that's what's key and important here is that Yeshua is teaching these disciples things that they're going to learn about the kingdom of heaven, but he wants them to understand function, not just understand the story, the form of it. What happens, how many soils, okay, there's 4. We said 4 is very common, in the Feast of Tabernacles, there's 4 species, the palm branches, the myrtle, the willow, the lemon-like fruit that's, we call the citron or an etrog. There's all these 4 factors of everything. And, 4 is very important because it shows the diversity of who's listening. Like in an audience, I always think about how many different people can I think about in the room. I've got males and females. I've got young children. I've got older, wiser people in the room than myself. I might have different people I'm talking to. And Jesus is always speaking to a diverse audience as a rabbi. So as they're asking this question about why he's speaking in parables, he says, you should know the mysteries of the kingdom. The you is the disciples. But he says, for them, it has not been given. So who's the them?
It would be the crowd.
That would be the crowds of people that are coming for whatever reason they're coming, but they're not really understanding because they're not his disciples. In other words, they're not committed to Jesus the way the disciples are committed.
Okay.
See, when you're committed to learning, you're committed to study, you're committed to prayer, you're committed to worship, you're a disciple who wants to be disciplined in each area that you're learning from Jesus.
Yeah.
The followers, there's no commitment. They come, they go. You don't even have names. See, disciples have names, followers don't. Disciples
true.
have names
Yeah.
because he calls you by name, like a shepherd and his sheep.
It's personal.
Yeah, it's very personal. While followers, you can look into a crowd of people, there's a bunch of followers, and you might see faces, but you don't know their names because they haven't gotten close to you.
Wow.
And the idea of following a rabbi and following in the dust of the rabbi is to get as close to the rabbi as possible, to learn how to do everything he does, emulate him, take on his character, nature, and literally be like him even when he's not present. Because Jesus was always preparing for his exit. So if you think about this question, it led to this story. Look at verse 13. It says, for this reason, I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, hearing they do not hear or understand. Verse 34 says, all these things Yeshua spoke to the crowds in parables, and apart from a parable, he wasn't speaking to them. In order to fulfill what was spoken from the prophet, I'll open my mouth in parables. I'll utter things hidden since the foundation of the world. So in every parable, there's some hidden revelation, right? And here's a key one. Verse 44 says, the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and hid. It says, because of his joy, he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. Verse 51 says, have you understood all these things? And they said to him, yes. Now, what's so funny about disciples? They're so eager. They're so zealous. He says, do you understand all these things? And they go, yeah.
Yeah, of course.
But just a second ago, if you were to read the verses in between, you'd find out that in this story of Matthew 13, there's a lot of things they don't understand. And so there's 4 soils that you can read about in Matthew 13, because he tells about this parable of the sower and the seed. You can also find it in Luke chapter 8. And I actually like to compare both so we can get the concept down, because each one of the Gospels, there's another set of four different Gospels.
So why 4?
Well, if you think about the 4 corners of the earth,
Okay.
even on the 4th day, there's all these sets of 4s, like 4 parts of a day: the morning, afternoon, evening, and night. 4 just shows the diversity within God's world, the 4 corners. Think about all the different kinds of people in the world, how the Jews were scattered to the 4 corners of the earth. So 4, whether you're talking about building a house with 4 corners, or, this table has 4 corners, there's something well-rounded about the space you're working with. So within a conversation, instead of just having dualistically good and bad, Jesus is showing with the element of 4 that there's diversity there, that not everyone's just good or bad. I think sometimes in Christianity we have a tendency to just put people in you're righteous or unrighteous.
You're depraved.
Yes. But, like even in the Festival of Tabernacles, someone might come to the Feast of Tabernacles, who is doing it to fulfill the mitzvah, the commandments of God, because they know the word. Then there's other people that are just doing it because they know it's a good deed to do, and they don't even know the commandment behind it. And then there's a person who doesn't know anything about Judaism, Jewish way of life, and they're just one of the inhabitants or the Israelites that are living in the land. They're living off the land, but they really have no religious expression at all. There's some people in Israel today like that. Sometimes you experience that when you go to the kibbutz. You go to a kibbutz where there's like a commune of people. They're working on a certain thing. They might be building stuff for the IDF. You never know what they're doing, but they're fed there. Their children grow up there, but they're not religious. And so while they're Israelites and part of the house of Israel, they're not in the category of either I know the Torah, I'm either doing the Torah, or I'm doing the commandments without even understanding them. It's just a different audience you're dealing with. And Jesus is dealing with that type of audience. In other words, he's dealing with Pharisees. He's dealing with Sadducees. He's dealing with zealots. He's dealing with the common people. They call them Am Haaretz, which is the people of the land. And I think sometimes when you talk in a parable, nobody has to be discriminated. Everybody's considered, and you walk away trying to figure out what the parable means. Okay, so think about this. The sower and the seed. The story tells us that the sower is casting seed, doesn't really tell us where he's casting and what direction, except that the seed is landing on 4 different types of soil. So I always relate this to the type of learner you are.
Okay.
So for instance, the first soil is said to be the wayside. It's a pathway where people walk. Do you think seeds are going to grow in that soil?
I don't think so, no, because it's constantly getting trampled on.
Yeah. Not only is the seed getting trampled on, and there's really no room for the seed to grow, it's on the surface. The birds snatch that kind of seed because they see it right there on the surface, they snatch it. And the word of God is called the seed. And the soil is the heart. And sometimes people are hearing the word, but it's only hitting them on the surface. They're a surface listener.
Wow.
They're not really listening. And the way you listen, the kind of ear you have to hear, right, or the eye you have to see, will determine what kind of learner you are. So whatever listener you are, that's the kind of learner you are. Have you ever talked to someone for maybe 10, 20 minutes and you realize they're not even paying attention?
Yes.
You could be at Starbucks and, you're telling them about your life, and next thing you know, you're saying something like, yeah, my grandmother just passed away. And they're like, oh, that's cool, dude. And you're
great.
like, oh,
Yeah,
I realize you have not been listening this whole time.
Yeah.
So I think it's important for us to be not a surface listener, because no seed can grow on the wayside.
No, yeah.
Either the seed will get eaten by the birds that come and snatch it up, or it'll be trampled on, like people's hearts that have been trampled on. They come in church, they come into the synagogue, their hearts have been trampled on. They can't receive. And so that's a kind of soil that I would say gets zero growth. There's no fruit coming from that type of soil.
Yeah.
So they're at
There'd be
zero.
nothing.
They're like an F when it comes to grading for the teacher to see what kind of learner you are, right? So the next soil he mentions is stony soil, or sometimes called rocky soil.
Right.
So sometimes we read the story or we listen to it, and whether you're in Sunday school hearing it, you think maybe it's just rocks on the surface.
It's in the dirt.
It's actually a rock surface underneath the soil. So imagine like a potted plant. The plant can only grow so deep.
Right.
And this kind of person is what we call a shallow listener, because the depth of soil is shallow. And
It
the
doesn't
roots,
go deep enough.
it can't go deep enough. So it's going to hit the surface and then it's going to start growing outward, but it can't go all the way down in growth to the river source, to the water.
So that when a wind or something comes
Or
on
sun.
the surface,
Or sun comes.
it can't
Which
withstand it.
the text says it will scorch
Yeah.
the plant because it has no water. And it's kind of like my basil plant I love buying from Trader Joe's. If you don't water that thing, it dries up. You give it a little water, all of a sudden the next day it's
Yeah.
all nice and green again. And I think sometimes people are like that. They're shallow in their listening. They're shallow in their learning. So therefore, when the heat and tribulation comes, they dry up. So that's another type of person listening to the parables of Jesus. They might not even identify that they're that soil until the Holy Spirit, based upon their spiritual hunger, begins to give them wisdom and knowledge. And that's what separates the followers from the disciples. Because the disciples don't learn just because Jesus is teaching parables.
Right.
The disciples come up to him and say, "What did you mean by that?" And see, that's what the followers don't do. The crowds don't do that.
Yeah, they're like, I want this to get deep down, and I want
Yeah.
get it.
Yeah. It's kind of like the typical, whether it's a Saturday worshiper on Shabbat at the synagogue or a Sunday worshiper on church service, like Destiny, has 3 campuses. And let's say someone shows up to one of the campuses and they're listening to the message, kind of like the nets being cast, the seeds being sown, but they're that shallow listener or they're that surface listener and they're really not paying attention. And then you don't see them for a whole week. Will
Yeah.
they be discipled very well if
Right.
that's all they get once a
They're
week?
just a weekend warrior.
Yeah, like a weekend warrior in sports, right? I think the problem is we find that you can't make disciples that way.
No, you can't.
So we came up with this curriculum that I get the privilege to not only write but to really teach, and that's what we call the journey, right? And we take you on this journey of being a disciple. In the synagogue, I call it walking in the dust of the rabbi.
Right.
And it's a very powerful set of teachings where we look at each one of the parables of Jesus. This is the one we use for the learner.
Yeah.
And the reason we do that is because we realize until you're in an environment where you can ask questions to the person teaching you, then you walk out just thinking either, I kind of know what that meant, I don't know what it means at all, I wish I knew what that meant, but you have no one to ask the question.
Right.
So unless you get connected, like someone signing up to be a disciple, to
Right.
become a disciple, become a leader, then you're not going to grow. Because all you did was walk away with this elusive story that really doesn't make sense to you, and you have no one to further study with or
Right.
ask the question. So, for instance, a life group is a great place to, connect with other brothers or sisters in the Lord or whoever you are in a circle of friends. You're getting in the Word together, and you're able to go deeper because you don't want to be that shallow or surface listener
Yeah.
or believer. Because disciples have to go deeper. So this is why you don't want to plant seed on a rocky surface, because there's no potential for it to grow any further. When if you're trying to grow, say, like a tree, it needs to be planted by the river, as Psalm 1 says, right? These
Right.
parables of Jesus are really quoting the Psalms of David and the parables of the prophets and the parables of the rabbis that Jesus grew up with. Not only asking questions, but giving answers, listening to them and dissecting what they're saying.
So what's the third type?
The third one is called the thorny soil, and this one gets kind of fun because it talks about distraction. I'm going to read you Matthew 13:22. It says, "The one on whom the seed was sown among thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the worries and distractions of the world and the deceitfulness choke the word, and it yields no fruit." This is interesting because the word distraction showed up, especially I'm reading it out of the Amplified, and the worries, the cares of this world are distractions.
Yeah.
Sometimes even social media can be a distraction. Instead of having our face in the book, we have our face in Facebook.
Yeah.
Scrolling and Instagram, we're taking selfies or we're looking
very
for
true.
something to inspire us when the Word of God is waiting for us every morning to be that inspiration. And I love the fact that when you think about thorns, it's very important that we not sow among thorns, because Jeremiah said this in Jeremiah 4:3, and I believe this is where Jesus was getting this from. He said, First of all, break up the fallow ground, that uncultivated land, right? It says, and make sure that you don't sow among thorns. So Jesus is talking about a sower who sows and some of the seed falls among thorns. The reason he's saying don't do that is because the thorns will choke the seed or the plant that's growing up. So how many people get in church, get in the synagogue, get in a place where they can grow spiritually, become a part of a discipleship program, and all of a sudden they're invested, they've signed up, they're going week to week, and then they stop coming and they stop committing because the distractions of this world, the worry of their bills, the job or the multiple jobs they maybe have to have just to keep afloat in this world, because they're letting the worry and the distractions of life take them away from the Word of God getting deeper in their heart.
Right.
So even though there's potential for growth here, it's really still a very low potential, because now it's no longer a seed in the ground or roots growing deep. It's actually coming up to the surface where the thorns can choke it. So if you think about these soils, they're very specific. I like to put percentages on them because the Bible even talks about how they'll be 30, 60, 100-fold. And I always question, why 30, 60, and 100-fold?
Yeah.
It wasn't until I read it in Luke that I got the answer. Let me read something to you in Luke chapter 8. I'm going to read to you starting with verse 11. It says, this is the parable. The seed is the word of God. Those on the wayside or the roadside are people who hear, but the devil comes and takes away the word from their hearts. Now, you think about this. The birds were like Satan or satanic influence that snatches it away. The next one talks about the rocky soil. It says, are those who hear the word and receive it with delight, but then they draw back. And then it says in verse 14, the seed that falls among the thorns represents people who hear, but they go on their way. They are choked by the cares and riches and pleasures of the world. It says those that are basically choked by the thorns, it says they don't bear proper ripening fruit. Or one version says, in the NLT, they won't grow into full maturity. But it says in verse 15, but the good soil are the ones who hear the word and hold on to it with an upright and good heart. See, the good soil, good heart. And they patiently produce fruit.
Wow.
And so when you think about this passage, it's telling you that only the good soil produces. Because if I back up to verse 8, it says, some fell into good soil and grew and yielded 100-fold.
Wow.
So I think of 100-fold like getting 100% on a test.
Right.
Because we're talking about learners here, right?
Yeah.
We're talking about learners who basically are learning at a certain level because they're either surface or shallow or distracted listeners, and then there's good listeners. Good listeners have a good heart, and they're like good soil.
Yeah.
And I think so many people come and hear a message, but because their heart's not in the right place, they're not ready to receive it. But when
they're not the right soil.
Yeah, and think about it, to even receive Yeshua as your Messiah or Jesus as your Lord, your heart has to be ready to receive the seed of that message for it to take root and you start to spiritually mature and grow.
Yeah.
So I think this is what we have to think about. We have to think about all these different soils. You know, when you think about the wayside soil, to me, it's like a disbelieving heart. You know, the stony or rocky soil, it's like a shallow heart. There's no root. You're not rooted and grounded in the word. The thorny soil, they're caught up in the cares and distractions of life. They're very unstable. And the soil's unstable, the environment's unstable. And then there's one that I believe that Jesus wants us to be like, the good soil.
Good soil. With
a good heart, to receive his good word in our hearts, to let it grow into good fruit.
Wow.
Because that's the only soil that can produce 100-fold harvest. And you know, that's even a Torah principle.
I would assume so.
Yeah, well, it goes back to Abraham, because Abraham had Isaac.
Yes.
Isaac was born in the land of Israel, lived there his whole life. And then it says he sowed in that land, the land of promise, in the land of Israel, and reaped 100-fold harvest.
Wow.
Showing that the land of Israel is a land flowing with milk and honey. It's a good land. It's a good soil. And then
Wow.
Deuteronomy 8:8 talks about all the different types of things harvested from the land: the barley, the wheat, the pomegranates, the figs, the grapes. It talks about the dates, even for honey. All of these special conditions that Israel has, it's considered good soil, while all the other nations were not. And even when it came to Israel, there are certain hearts in Israel, even among the Israelis, that some had different types of soil or different types of hearts, and they would receive or not receive. So I think there's just so much about our heart and even the way we listen. Because remember, the goal was to have eyes to see and ears to hear. And if you're not a good listener, it's because you couldn't understand what you were listening and the seed never got planted deep enough in your heart.
The distinction is that the crowd and the followers, there's wayside soil in the crowd, there's thorns in the crowd, and there's also rocky soil in the crowd.
Okay, not just in the crowd. Even right now, there are people listening. There are people watching. Their hearts are hurt from the wayside. They've been trampled on. Things have been snatched from them.
Yeah.
The enemy has tried to attack them. You know, that's a wayside heart. And then there's hearts out there, I mean, they were growing, they were doing good, and they hit a surface. They hit a rock surface, and they couldn't grow any further. They've kind of capped out on their growth. Then you got the people that you meet them, and you're like, man, you're so distracted. I mean, you're signing up for everything, but you're really completing nothing.
Right.
And it's all the worry and all the pain and all the stress that they sometimes even put on their own selves.
Yeah.
That they can't follow Jesus as close as they want to and get dusty from the dust of the rabbi because they can't continue on the journey with him. Because, no, I've got to bury my parents one day, and I've got to, I'm a rich young ruler, and I've got all this wealth. What do I do with it? And there's all these disciples potentially Jesus meets on the road. But only 12 followed him faithfully. And even out of those 12, 3 in the inner circle were always with him, praying with him, asking those tough questions. And I think someone today, they need that. And really what Jesus is looking for is a few good men with a few good hearts. Few good ladies, too, that with good hearts. See, there were so many men and women that followed Jesus, followed the disciples, and became a part of that apostolic missionary mission to take this message around the world.
Yeah.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. And if you did, follow us for more episodes as you rate and review the podcast. Thank you for listening to the Dust of the Rabbi podcast with Rabbi Brian Baruch Bileci. Shalom. Lehitrot. See you next time.